Kiwi journalist Tom Mutch in Ukraine. Tom, I was gonna say good evening. It's good evening for one of us and good morning for the other. I'll just say hi. Hi, how you doing, man?
Hi, how you doing? I'm all
Yeah.
right. I'm all right, thanks.
You
How are
safe?
Yeah. Well safe here.
Yeah, things going well for you. Where are you at the moment?
I'm currently in Lviv, so I'm about to leave Ukraine just for a short break. I
Right.
kind of needed it. I've been here since the start, so
So that's the plan. You're heading out of country for a while because you just need a break, need some space.
I need I need a bit of R&R. Yeah, just for a week, maybe two, but then I'll be back to it.
What does a war correspondent do when they're taking a week off?
I mean, some people, it depends. Some of us do completely normal things. One girl said she wanted to spend her vacation in Saudi Arabia, and I was like, okay, you enjoy that. Not quite for me. I'm just gonna go chill out. I'm gonna go to Paris. See, it's one of my best friend's birthdays there, so I'll go there. Honestly, have a few beers because booze has been banned in Ukraine for the last month. So
Wow.
nothing too intense.
I would have thought primarily because of the location and the akinness in the past to the Russian people, vodka would have been pretty big in Ukraine. Is that a drink of choice normally?
It is a drink of choice normally, but it's been banned. And I actually, as I found out, it's been banned for very, very good reason. I've got a little anecdote I can tell you about if you like.
Go for it.
So basically, they temporarily re-allowed the sale of booze about 3 or 4 days ago now, and I was in Kharkiv on Saturday or Sunday, and I remember that I turn up to the supermarket about 10 a.m. There's some guy, people are buying alcohol. It's the first time I've seen it, and there's this one guy. He's just a bit out of it. He's like just chatting to me in Russian, which I can barely understand.
Yeah.
And he's buying booze like 10 a.m. He's already plastered. And in a way, I felt, okay, this is almost like feeling like life's getting back to normal again. But then gets a bit scarier later. It's about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm just walking along with like the Ukrainians who I'm working with and another one of my journalist friends. And all of a sudden, someone starts screaming at me, stop, in Russian. And I turn towards it, and there's this police guy who's just running towards me. He's got his gun like pointed literally right at my head, and he's like, oh, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Whoa!" Like, and he comes up to me. I can smell his breath is stinking of booze. He like grabs my camera, rips it off me. He starts like yelling at us. Meanwhile, the whole time he's got his gun like kind of going between my chest and my head. I'm like, "Whoa, Jesus!" And thankfully, he's with colleagues who are like calming him down, but he keeps on like yelling, like, "Who are you? Why do you want to talk to people here? Why do you want to take photos?" And I'm like, "Well, we're journalists. We're journalists." He's like, "Yeah, but why do journalists interview people? Why do they take photos? Blah blah blah." I'm like, that was pretty scary. Drunk people with guns at your head. It's never fun.
I think we've kind of talked about this before. We've talked about, have you been in any hairy situations and scary situations? Like, not to just focus on Ukraine, but what you've just told us, is that like one of the times you've been kind of most worried about your own personal safety? Does anything else jump to mind, especially of the current conflict?
So weirdly enough, it's different people. This is one thing I noticed: different people get in war zones get scared by very different things. When I hear shooting, small arms fire, I get a bit spooked. When I hear artillery, for whatever reason, artillery or explosions, it just kind of doesn't bother me because I'm like, oh well, So it seems so sort of like up in the sky and kind of an act of God that it's like I almost feel like I can't really do much about it. I've been in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. We had a Turkish drone flying after our car, taking shots at us. That was pretty scary.
Yeah.
Ukraine so far, like I was in the outskirts of Kiev, and there was a gun battle broke out probably about a kilometer or two away from where I was, but it never got to our positions, so we didn't have like shots going over our heads or anything else. I mean, after a while, it just kind of becomes part of the job. You just get used to it in a weird sort of way.
It's madness, isn't it? And then in the same instance, you put a message on your Facebook page or a picture on your Facebook page of Lviv, where you are, and it looks like any European city just kind of hanging out doing their thing.
Completely. Like, that could so easily be Poland or Prague or Budapest or whatever, couldn't it?
Or
It's
Paris,
just,
where you're about to go.
yeah, exactly. And it's so the west of Ukraine still hasn't really been hit. Now there have been there was a missile strike on a base near Lviv, but in terms of life in the city, it's pretty much gone back to normal. And not only that, it used to be kind of very, very chaotic and crowded because it was full of refugees trying to get out. By now, most people who wanted to leave Ukraine have left Ukraine. Probably I'd say about, yeah, it's in the millions now. It keeps on rising and rising. I think it's up to about 4 million or so. But most people who want to leave have left by now. So it's kind of calmed itself down. And even in like war times, people find like a rhythm of life. Even if it's a new rhythm of life, they still find a rhythm that they get back into.
There must be that constant anxiety though, that like you get into the rhythm, but you know that tomorrow morning the tanks could be there or whatever date things could be happening. But I'm interested in how life can go back to normal even in war zones. And it's a bit of a flippant or silly example, but I remember watching an episode of Top Gear where they did the Middle East run and they landed in Iraq and then they went up through down. But 500 meters to the right, there might be kids playing in the playground, or life can continue on some level of normality for people living in war zones, which sounds bizarre to say that out loud, but I mean, you've just shown it. And I guess it's something we need to remember as well, that there are people there just living lives in a war zone.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, and obviously, I don't see this as like to say, oh, the media is lying to you, or it's all like exaggerating stuff, but like what gets shown on the news is the worst parts, right?
Yeah,
like the stuff you see it's all very true and very, very important to show, but it is the most extreme aspects of what is going on, which is why sometimes I like to post videos like that just to show a little bit of the other side. Like, okay, it's not all like this, like all the time.
Yeah.
In fact, that you see the worst 5%, but the rest of it is just people trying to live their normal lives. Now, a lot of their normal lives has completely changed. Most people's jobs have stopped being their ordinary jobs, and they're in some way supporting the military effort. So, most people I know who are like, lawyers or consultants, they all like work in volunteer shelters. They try and coordinate logistics for the armed forces and everything like that. But even in Kharkiv, for instance, which I was at, which is like one of the worst bombed places, I was actually surprised. It was very interesting to see in Kharkiv, which has just been bombed, really. What I was surprised to see was how people there were actually a bit calmer and a bit more relaxed than people further west, where the war hadn't really started yet, where people were a lot more tense.
Almost like the ones further west, almost like the fear of the unknown, because it's not here yet. We're more freaked out than the people who are in it are like, this is terrible, but we can manage.
Exactly. Yeah. Because in Kharkiv, they've been through 3-4 weeks of extraordinarily intense bombardment, but they're like, okay, we know how to deal with this now. Our lives, our sort of mental states and our emotional states and our physical conditions have adjusted to being able to accept this. So now, and it's like, well, we've seen the worst of it, and we've survived the worst of it, so we know we can handle it. Whereas people in the West are still a little bit more like, oh my God, what's going to happen? I'm not saying it's not terrible, but it's how people sort of adjust.
You're talking about people's jobs have kind of evolved into supporting the war efforts. We were going to talk to someone yesterday. We are going to talk to them before they leave, but there's people coming from all over the world to Ukraine to fight. So we've got an interview set up with a guy who's 41. He was born in Ukraine. He moved to New Zealand when he was 8. He is coming back to Ukraine to fight. How do the Ukrainians on the ground there today feel about? I mean, he's not a foreign national. He's a Ukrainian who has moved away. I'll just put you in full screen while I fix my camera. Who has moved away and come back. But how do the Ukrainians feel about foreign nationals and I guess their former citizens coming back for the purpose of fighting?
So important to differentiate between the two. I think a lot of Ukrainians feel quite that Ukrainians who live overseas, most Ukrainians I think feel that these people should be coming back, or at least the men of fighting age. should be coming back and should be supporting the war effort. And I think the number, it's quite high numbers. We're talking like 400, 500,000 like men of fighting age have returned to Ukraine to fight, knowing, by the way, that as soon as they step foot across the Ukrainian border, they will not be allowed to leave until the war ends.
Wow.
So it's a very, very brave sacrifice that they're making. In terms of the actual other soldiers, so it's interesting is that I think the Ukrainians know that in terms of like, they're not going to get like the amount of international volunteers that would actually change the war effort, but they're going to get two things out of it. One, it shows the international community's solidarity and
Yep.
makes the international community putting more skin in the game, means they're going to get more media attention because, you know, a Ukrainian soldier is not going to make the news in New Zealand like a New Zealand volunteer is going to make the news in New Zealand. And the same for Australia, UK, whatever. Also, I know a couple of people out here, and I can't give too many details, but they include Kiwis who are former military who are out here, and as soon as they've crossed the border, they've been like, okay, you guys are going to train all of the volunteers we need to train up, right? So they've got a very important role there in training, because the Ukrainians are not really conscripted because so many people haven't needed to, so many people have volunteered, but a lot of those people are now being trained by sort of ex-British or New Zealand or Australian military or what have you.
I've got a question really about the conscription. Because, yep. And I know that I asked you about COVID, and you basically were like, oh, fuck, you know, we're not more worried about war than COVID over here at the moment. And maybe this is a bit of a similar question because it's about Fox News. But there's some criticism of Ukraine on Fox News by some of its commentators. And one of the criticisms was, you know, gosh, what kind of country would have to conscript its people? Of course, ignoring their 100 years of history, going right up into the Vietnam War where they were conscripting their own people. But it was sort of one of the criticisms. And then also, and I'm sure you've heard of this, there was a leaked memo from the Kremlin telling Russian media to play as much Tucker Carlson as possible. This is what the memo said. It's essential to use as much fragments of broadcasts of the popular Fox News host Tucker Carlson, who sharply criticizes the actions of the United States and NATO, their negative role in unleashing the conflict in Ukraine, and the defiantly provocative behavior from the leadership of the Western countries and NATO towards the Russian Federation and towards President Putin personally. Does that kind of news get through to you guys in Ukraine? Are Ukrainians hearing about this American network who has this appearance that they're kind of supporting Putin over Zelensky, as crazy as that sounds? And is there any reaction to it?
Okay, so I'll go through I'll deal with the conscription one first. Because so this conscription one is interesting in the sense that, look, so, I mean, yes, technically conscription exists, but no one is getting press ganged into military service here. I mean, I've heard this from a lot of people. It's a joke, but it's a joke that's based on reality, is that they have so many people who've signed up to fight, they don't even have enough weapons to give them at the moment, you know? Ukraine used to have compulsory military service, as a lot of countries do, right? You know, South Korea, Singapore, even some of the Scandinavian countries would have, like Israel, the most obvious example, would have like a few years of compulsory military service. I think in Ukraine they had one for men. And they said, look, people used to bribe their way out of military service. Now the queues are so long, people are bribing their way into military service, right?
I have to say that was one of the responses by some American commentators with the criticism of the conscription model that is being said also on American television, that there's too many people volunteering at the moment to even worry about conscription. So that's actually been getting out there to the critics of Fox News. What about what Fox News is actually saying? What do the people in Ukraine think about that? Is that making any noise in Ukraine?
Yeah. Okay. So also, I do want to say here, and I don't mean to be like, you know, I don't mean to sound like I'm supporting Fox News here, but you can't say that Fox News is just Tucker Carlson, right? Like,
of course.
Yes, he is one of their very popular hosts. But look, Fox News have actually, and this is the very strange thing, is that Fox News have actually done good reporting out in Ukraine. You know, there was the Fox News crew that was killed in one of the most dangerous parts of Ukraine a couple of weeks ago. So I don't want to sort of say, you know, everything Fox has done here has been bad. But yes, it has.
Let me just say before you go on, completely fair. I kind of used the phrase Fox News when we were talking specifically about Tucker Carlson. So yeah, let's just keep it to Tucker Carlson. I accept that. You're correct. So let's not muddy the waters and just talk about the Tucker Carlson support of Russia and Putin.
Well, I mean, Ukrainians have seen it. Also, most Ukrainians, don't necessarily. But I'm talking about the sort of the younger, the more educated ones. I had lunch with a young woman yesterday who used to live in Louisiana for who spent a year at high school in Louisiana, and she said, "Yes, I'm familiar with all these people. Yes," and she's like, they're one of the biggest thorns in our side because we worry that while support is overwhelming for Ukraine now, that like down the road, gas prices start to hike in America, or there's some knock-on effects of this war in the rest of the world, that these people like Tucker Carlson or whoever they might find a more sympathetic audience once the war starts to hit the pockets of like ordinary Americans, if that makes sense. So that's one thing that they are really quite concerned
about. There's some reports, and I think you might have either reported this or passed on the report as well, that for a while there was some sympathy towards Russians in the eastern part of Ukraine. The reports are now any sympathy or any kind of care for Russians in that part of Ukraine is now gone. It's been abandoned. Is that accurate? Is that happening? Can you expand on that at all?
Absolutely. So I as I said, I was in Kharkiv. But for those who don't know, Kharkiv is the second biggest city in Ukraine. It's right on the border with Russia. It's got about 1.5 million people, I think, maybe a little bit more. And it is completely Russian. Like the Russian-speaking is like 98% of the population or whatever. And it's a city that used to be part of the Russian Empire. All the architecture is sort of very grand imperial Russian architecture. And it's also, as I said earlier, I think one of the most heavily bombed places in the country. And you go there, and I just wrote like a long. Anyone who wants to read this in more detail, I just wrote a long feature article about this from a US magazine. Is basically that what has happened is they are even more angry and there's even more hatred for Russia in these previous parts than there was beforehand, because they say, these are in some cases literally our brothers, our cousins. Like this one woman I did an interview with, she was literally pulling her belongings from the rubble of her house, and she's like, it's the Russian terrorists who did this, and my father is Russian, right? Wow. She gave another example where one of the other people who lived in her apartment, he was FaceTiming. He was in hospital. He was FaceTiming with his sister who lives in Moscow. And his sister's like, oh, I'm so sorry. It's so horrible that the Nazis did that to you. And he's like, no, this wasn't the Nazis. Wow. She's like, yes, it was. It was other Ukrainians. Russia doesn't do this. We know this from our news. This was the Nazi Ukrainians who did this to you. Like even when her own brother is in a hospital bed, like that. And so all of those like long-standing linguistic, cultural, familial ties between Eastern Ukraine and Russia are just being absolutely destroyed. And I don't think that they will take generations, maybe hundreds of years to come back.
And strategically, the strange thing that seems to happen with that as well is geographically. I mean, you tend to have a kinship with people who are closest to you. Like, whether it's a localized kind of, we like the people down the road more so than the people on the other, island of New Zealand, or, we feel closer to the Australians and the Americans, or so to attack so harshly the eastern part of Ukraine, which I would imagine the further west you go, the less Russian it becomes, the more it gets into Europe. Therefore, basically the attacking, as you're saying, our literal or figurative brothers and sisters on the east seems to be a peculiar decision to make, as opposed to, I don't know if cruise missiles can go that far, but going for the western side of the country, which might be less aligned with Russian values, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, part of this is sort of in military and strategic terms, the West doesn't have a huge amount of value, but it's also it's just much closer, right? Like there are a lot more Russian. There's a lot more Russian military installations, and bases that have close ability to attack Eastern Ukraine. They already have the separatist forces in Eastern Ukraine that they've had. There's a good 10,000 troops there, nothing to sort of sniff at. It's also the fact, though, that Vladimir Putin's whole idea was, well, we won't have to attack these cities. They're Russian cities. As soon as we get there, there'll be a popular uprising that will kick out the Zelensky regime and welcome us as liberators. And they were just apparently they were legitimately shocked when they got there to find that the cities were fighting back. And so that part of what's going on now, we think, is kind of a punishment bombardment, right? Well, there's two reasons for it, both equally
Oh,
horrible. One is
wow.
that there's a punishment. Okay. The only thing I can really analogy I can think of it in my mind is kind of like the jealous ex-husband who kills his wife and her new
Yeah,
partner. If I can't love you, no one else. If I can't have you, no one else can.
yeah,
And the number two, which is equally chilling, is the idea that right now the Ukrainian army has a lot of really well defended, really well held positions, and they want to try and draw them out of those positions so that they can protect their own civilian population, but where they're a lot more vulnerable. So move troops out of their fortified locations in on the Donbass line of contact or around Kiev to try and get them to go to Kharkiv and Mariupol and break those sieges, but make them a lot more vulnerable in the process. So they basically have the chance, keep your defensive positions and keep your cities, or watch your civilians be like massacred. That's the kind of choice they're being given.
often wars become winning hearts and minds and souls,
Yeah.
and obviously what you've just told us about a brother phoning his sister in Russia, the hearts and souls of the Russian people haven't been won by Ukraine at the moment. They've been won by Putin's message. I see that Russia's banned Facebook and Instagram after labeling the parent company Meta an extremist organization. President Biden has recently called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. I'm interested in your opinion. What do you think would be the best way to get the message to the Russian people as to what's really going on? Is there a way to cut through? Is there a way to get them that message, around the Putin sort of media outlets?
Well, so you have to remember, it is still worth remembering that these are early days, right? Like this has only been it feels, especially for me, it feels like this has been going on for years. It's only been going on it's 4 weeks today. It's been exactly
Oh, wow,
28
okay.
days. And a lot of what is going to happen in Russia, the domestic, there's always a little bit of like, even in the most what conflicts that turned out to be the most unpopular, there is a bit of a rally around the flag effect at first, right? Like even the Iraq War was like popular when it started, even though it got much, much more unpopular as it dragged on.
Yeah.
And so, you're going to have effects like, sanctions are really going to start to bite. They're going to take a while, but they're going to bite in the next month or two. Sanctions are really going to start to bite. People are going to realize that actually they can't go abroad anymore, which, might not have affected them now, but affects their future prospects of what they want to do with their lives and their children's lives. They're going to realize how cut off they are. They're going to then the economic sanctions are going to bite. There's going to be shortages in shops, and there's going to be, all of these bad things that happen to the Russian domestic political situation. That is going to take time to filter through, but it
Yeah.
will happen. Now, I know there's been some very, very interesting things that people have done. I remember there was like some organization, I wish I could remember the name, that was basically providing the cell phone number of just ordinary Russian people to, on a big list, so that you could text them and say, hi, here's like videos of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment.
Wow.
Telegram channels are still very popular. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger did that big, if anyone hasn't watched it, it's like just a persuasion masterclass of like 9 minutes where he talks about how much he loves Russia and then how much of what Russia's doing is terrible. That was circulated on a lot of Russian Telegram channels. Some Russian people still have VPNs. I'm still talking to people on Instagram and Facebook who have VPNs in Russia. So there are ways to do this, but it won't be an overnight thing.
The other thing I was wondering that kind of goes alongside what Russia is hearing is, Russians. I read that 15,000 troops have died according to NATO, Russian troops, and also this story came out. I think it's just a couple of hours ago. Russian journalist Oksana Bolina killed in Kiev shelling. So she was in Kiev and she was reporting, and so Russian citizens, Russian journalists, Russian soldiers are all dying. I mean, is that also equally hard to filter that message through to the Russian people?
So I saw a really interesting, again, very, very chilling fact about this is that apparently a lot of the Russian soldiers are being used in Ukraine are sort of the Russian ethnic minorities from the eastern parts of the country. We're talking about like Kazakhs and Uzbeks and people like that.
Yeah.
What they're trying is to see not from from Moscow, St. Petersburg into the fighting as they possibly can at this point in time, just because eventually, that's another thing that will take time to filter through. Eventually, all of these, families who are told your son is going on military exercise and he doesn't come home ever, they're going to figure that out. And there's the numbers are just so high. It's hard to say with any certitude, but it's at least 10,000. It's about what was killed in their war in Afghanistan over 10 years, and that had a domestic political impact, and that was strung out over 10 years. This is over a month. It also just gives you a kind of an idea of just how intense this conflict is, right? This is way, 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 way more intense than anything than like Afghanistan or Iraq was, or anything like that.
You're 4 weeks in. You're going on a break, off to Paris for a wee while. What do you know better today in Ukraine than you were not aware of on day one? What's more of a reality to you today than you didn't know on day one?
So that's the kind of thing, to give a good answer, I'll probably have to think about how I feel on the day out, because it's just been so kind of moment to moment. All right, bang, do this, story, file. I keep on saying that one thing I have been very impressed by is the way that the Ukrainians have sort of come together as a nation. It's almost a bit of a kind of a soppy bit of a Hollywood story about, this kind of underdog nation that really has come together around its people to fight this aggressive invader. But it is true in a matter of fact. And, it's been amazing to see just how people are legitimately committed to their to the defense of their homeland, and many, many, many people you meet genuinely say, I'm willing to die to defend my country. And I guess if there's one thing that I've learned, it's that, for a lot of people, there are things still, I know we say we're cynical in the modern world, but where there are still things that people find worth dying for. And remember that Putin has said effectively, and his messaging has been so bad, it's been so good at uniting Ukrainian people. He said, I don't believe Ukraine is a real country, and he's made it perfectly clear that if he wins his war, Ukraine will not exist ever again as a country. And the Ukrainian people have stood up and said, we will not accept this, and we're willing to die to protect and defend this. And I think that's quite a valuable thing.
So when you're actually out the door, when you're off to France?
I'm leaving today. I'm going to Poland today, and then I'll be flying out on Saturday.
And are you flying from Lviv to Poland, or do you have to get across the border like in vehicles, or what happens?
You just get vehicles. It used to be huge queues, but they've massively gone down now. All of Ukrainian airspace is closed. There are no flights going in or out, or the only flights are fighter jets.
Right.
So, maybe a hitch a ride on one of those on the way back. Let's see.
And there'll be no problems with you at the border. I mean, you're a man of fighting age. You just flash your New Zealand passport. I'm assuming you're traveling.
Also, I've got a press accreditation that allows you to move around the country pretty easily. So you just flash those out. You'll be.
Hey, Tom Mutch, Kiwi journalist in Ukraine. Thanks so much for being with us. A handful of times here in Big Hairy News. I really hope you have a good week off. I hope you can get some good sleep and find some big comfy beds with big soft pillows and drink lots of good coffee. Is the coffee good in Ukraine?
No, it's pretty rubbish. I'm afraid. Sorry, Ukrainian food, Ukrainian drinks. They haven't been the highlight of the trip, I'm afraid. Right.
Well, I'm sure you'll treat yourself once you get to Paris. Treat yourself like a god and have a good break. And I'll be watching your Twitter feed in Paris to see you under the Eiffel Tower having a bit of a break. But other than that, hopefully we'll talk again sometime in the future. Have a good break, and thanks so much for being a part of the show to this point.
No worries. I've enjoyed it.